Welcome to this week's edition of Cogley and Morrow on Politics. We're glad that you could join us this week. I'm in the chair in studio again this week, and Dr. Cogley will be joining us later in the show, where we'll give a little bit of attention to the discussion around a vice presidential running mate for Joe Biden, now that it's assured he's wrapped up the nomination and moving toward the convention in the summer. The discussion is around who will be his running mate and what impact that will be. So Dr. Cogley will join us for that. But up first today, we are joined by Dr. Dustin Edwards, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences here on the Tarleton campus. And our focus, of course, last week and this week has certainly been on the pandemic that is happening around the globe, but especially here in the past week, we've seen the impact of this across the United States as different areas, different regions, cities are struggling to respond to this, as we're seeing in some places the challenges of providing health care, emergency health care in certain situations, and just the concerns in general that people have as we've seen government at all levels respond to this in a variety of ways. And so one of our a focus that we have on this show is getting you information. How do you get in touch with the kinds of information you need to analyze, understand what is happening, especially in terms of government and politics in our country, but also on these critical issues as public health is a major issue within the realm of public policy. I teach a class on public policy at the graduate level, and one of the things that we did was adjust some of the assignments to really look at this because of that intersection between public administration, public policy, and public health. But again, the focus here is on information. It's on using the resources that we have here at Tarleton State, and we're glad to have Dr. Edwards on with us today. He has his PhD in biomedical sciences from the Baylor College of Medicine, and he teaches courses in genetics, in virus isolation, in bioinformatics, and vaccines. And so all of these areas touch very much on what is happening around us, what is happening in our country and around the world. Welcome, Dr. Edwards. Tell us a little bit more about your background and really how your work, your research, and your teaching connect with what is happening.
As you said, I got my PhD at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston at the Texas Medical Center, and I studied retroviruses. When I was growing up, the big pandemic we had was HIV, and so whenever I was an undergraduate, or actually I was in high school, that's all we ever was talked about on television and in the newspaper. So as I was making my way through college, high school and college, I decided I wanted to study HIV and other viruses that seemed unstoppable. And I studied HIV and another related virus called HTLV. After that, I went to work at the national laboratories at the National Institutes of Health, where I continued that work. After that, I came to here, and we continued to work with retroviruses. Some of the focus has been on avian retroviruses, and we are also have started working with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute with discovering new bacteriophages, which are viruses that can be used to treat antibiotic-resistant infections. And all the classes that I teach all relate together towards this, where students learn about cell and molecular biology. You have to know how it works in order to know how viruses are breaking it. And from there, we have classes in virology, classes in vaccines. We teach students how to isolate and discover new viruses, how to use current tools such as bioinformatics to characterize those viruses. And as far as like the current pandemic that's going on now, we're starting to see secondary infections that are occurring. And so some of these bacteriophages, which are viruses that can kill bacteria, could be used to treat some of those patients. So it's something that's definitely making its way around social media right now, and how researchers like us can kind of help with this current pandemic.
Well, Dr. Edwards, a lot of the reading I've been doing, being involved in, like I said, public policy and kind of analyzing it from that angle, a lot of the things that we've seen or the things that I've engaged with have shown that scientists in these areas, scholars in these areas, have said that something like this was on the horizon. That there was some anticipation that at some point we may see, even though we've seen smaller scale things like Ebola and the SARS and other things that have happened just in the recent past, certainly nothing of this magnitude. What could you give us a little background on that, and just how, what really goes into the analysis and thinking about how something like this could happen, and now we're kind of right in the middle of it.
Right. So, yeah, there was a couple of papers published, quite a few years ago now, in around 2013, 2014, 2015, that indicated that there were coronaviruses that could have mutations that would allow it to infect both animals and people. And so a little bit of a warning went out because SARS had happened 10 years previously. And so with this, and SARS is a very similar coronavirus. And so there was kind of a little bit of a warning that, we saw it once before, and it very much is possible now. So they did that was all in the laboratory indicating how it could happen. And then there was a follow-up study that showed that in bats, there was a coronavirus that could use a receptor called ACE2 that we have. And so there was definitely this possibility of a coronavirus moving from animals to people. And we've seen this before with other viruses as people move into into new areas, as we expand our population. You have these meat markets that contain wild animals. And so we saw in Africa with retroviruses, which with those HTLVs that I was studying before, in which the monkeys would have the virus, and then in the process of interacting with the animals, either while hunting them or in processing them for the market, you can end up with cuts, or you end up with some of the animals' fluids in the mouth of the hunters or butchers, and so you can actually have the transmission of the virus that way. And so there has been some warnings going on for a while now. Of course, the previous administration dealt with H1N1 influenza virus, and lessons were learned from that. And so we've had a couple of administrations previous to this one that had dealt with pandemics and had started to kind of build a playbook for it. And then we're at the current administration, which seems to have ignored some of those warning signs.
Right, we've seen that with, and we've talked about this in other areas and agencies of government where this kind of focus on trimming, trying to reduce the size in certain departments and so forth, that has had an impact, and I assume that's going to be a topic for analysis for years to come in terms of looking at what had happened before, what's happening now, and how government, at least at the federal and even at the state levels, can be prepared. Last week we talked about the public health system in Texas and the challenges there in being able to handle something like this. And part of that is the severity of it. I mean, I think part of the challenge that we saw early on in this was that people making comparisons with flu and with other epidemics, pandemics that we've had in the past that may not have had such a significant impact on the U.S. population, but we see with this a level of severity of impact on people at various stages, various health conditions. What's the kind of a little bit about the science of that in layman's terms? What is that? How do we help people understand what makes this different from, say, like regular flu or some of the other epidemics we've seen in the recent past?
Okay. There's a couple of main differences. One is where the virus is able to infect. And so there's some viruses that can infect the upper respiratory tract, and some viruses that can affect the lower respiratory tract. And some of that has to do with the differences in the temperature between near your opening versus near your core. The new coronavirus can affect both the upper and lower respiratory tract. In addition, there's a long incubation period, relatively long, so it can be a week or two, and so you can walk around and be infectious but not have any symptoms yet, so you're able to spread it. In addition, with some of the testing that's coming out, we know that some people are just asymptomatic, meaning that they have no symptoms, and so they're going about their day, and they're not getting sick, and they're able to spread the virus to other people. And then you start to look at the people who are being severely affected, and many of them are going to be elderly people, and you have this thing called a cytokine storm, in which there is an overreaction. Your immune system responds way overboard, and so as the virus is replicating and damaging cells in the lungs, you're going to have an immune response to that site, and at that point the immune system then causes even more damage as it recruits more and more of its members down there.
So we've seen this spread like that. I mean, this is just the rapid pace of this across the globe, and some of the research that's been conducted that we see coming out in the last week or so has looked at this and trying to kind of understand where we stand on actual cases, infection rates, and mortality rates, and so on. And so some of these have pointed to, like what you're saying, that there's the infection rate is probably so much higher than confirmed cases, and part of that is trying to determine actually what that is, because until you have that kind of data, you can't determine an accurate mortality rate and then compare this to other viruses that we've seen. In terms of that research, how beneficial is that in terms of really understanding this? How challenging is it? I mean, I would assume it's very challenging when, like you say there are people walking around that are asymptomatic, and how do you actually determine an infection rate? And then we possibly could get into a little bit of talking about what role does that kind of information have when we're looking at our policymakers at the federal and state and local levels trying to make decisions based on that information.
There's going to have to be some additional testing later in order to try to acquire those numbers, or as the virus kind of continues to make its way across our country and we step up the number of tests we do. That's when you're going to start to get more data, more numbers. What we've seen with other countries that have smaller geographies, still a lot of people, but a smaller geographies, they can get testing done, is that the infection rate appears to be lower than the initial data showed, because, as you mentioned, a lot of people were asymptomatic, or you go in and you think you had symptoms, but it turned out that they were negative. So I think the infection rate those numbers will go down. Same with the fatality rate is likely to go down. As far as the people who have symptoms and are being hospitalized, so there's a lot of numbers on that, and the one that seems to be sticking out the most is around 15 to 20% of people who have symptoms are being hospitalized. So I don't know if that number will change or not, because if you have symptoms, you're probably getting tested, and so I think those numbers are valid. Those numbers will hopefully change in future years, or if there's a second wave. So once people start to have immunity, start to develop herd immunity, so hopefully we can protect those that are at risk a little bit more, even just kind of passively, just by having the virus, having our immune system react to it. It just will stop other people from having the virus pass through us into them.
Right. I've heard some early or seen some things as well that says that this doesn't mutate as quickly as the as such certain flu viruses, where it would take it longer for people who have an immunity to it, that if this thing does change at some point in time, we might be better prepared. I'm not sure how. I mean, this is this is coming very early, and
yeah.
But some of that kind of information helps people look at this long term. How do we deal with this on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, that's actually a positive thing for all of us. And so the data right now is showing that the virus does not mutate very quickly. the good news about that is that we can probably develop a vaccine that'll be good for a long time. So unlike, say, the flu vaccines, which have to be analyzed every year, this one, once it's made, should be good for a while. And so if you're a policymaker, it would make sense to try to get this vaccine produced and then go about distributing it to people.
We see in that policy realm the challenges that I've watched several of the press conferences that Governor Cuomo has had out of New York, which seems to be the hardest hit area in the country at the moment, and the way that this is overwhelming health resources, and so there's definitely an impact here that says that in terms of public health systems, in terms of collaboration between governments and health systems, both private and public, there are some significant challenges there, and just some immediate needs that, whether it's ventilators or masks or other medical equipment that are needed. But how does this? You mentioned one about putting an emphasis on finding a vaccine, putting the resources there. What other? Where do you see other connections here with the role that government at the state, federal, or even the local level have in engaging with something like this? I mean, we talk about this in our classes in political science and government, where you elect people to go to represent you, to make decisions. And most of those people have a working knowledge of about 4 or 5 areas. Outside of that, they're not experts in many things. And so something like this comes along, and it's very challenging because you have people who are trying to make decisions that are in the best interest of the country, of their states, their constituents, and their citizens in their localities, but yet they don't understand necessarily all the implications of this. What does someone in your field bring to that dialogue that helps them to kind of work through this and try to make the best decisions possible?
Yes, I think I would like to praise our local government, local businesses, the local schools, and the universities. So they acted very quickly on this matter. So they took an evidence-based approach. They saw the numbers. I think they had advisors. They were able to make a decision before it got bad here. They're going to have to deal with the economic implications of it later, but they were able to protect people now and get people into the habit of thinking about these things. So most people don't walk around thinking about viruses and pandemics the way that, for example, someone like I do. So just getting people to be mindful of it's hard. I think here at the local level that people have a higher trust in their officials. We see them. I think that's one difference. They're real people. At the federal level, I'm never going to meet Donald Trump. I might meet the mayor, though, but I'm never going to meet Donald Trump. And so, and then they get, I'm sure they have many more advisors. They're probably having more, a lot of people on the left side of their ears saying, hey, we need to do these things, and another person on their other side saying, well, we need to do something opposite of that. And so it's got to be hard. It's got to be hard having to make those types of decisions.
Oh, yes, definitely. We had Mayor Doug Savine here in Stephenville in the studio here a few months ago, and we talked about paving roads and the cost there and what the needs were. And what happens with a situation like this is it's such a dramatic shift in focus. I saw this after 9/11. I was in New York City when that happened and worked with a number of different groups post 9/11 and the recovery efforts. But you begin to see a lot of shift in policy and focus, especially on Homeland Security. I mean, you had the creation of a whole new department of government. But these kinds of events shift focus for a period of time and often divert resources from other areas and other needs. That's probably going to happen here. I think we'll see this at all levels of government. With your background and experience with this, where do you think some of the very critical needs will be going forward that policymakers and local to federal officials will need to give attention to in the months and years ahead?
Well, immediately, my understanding is that there's a high need for ventilators. Many of the car manufacturers are currently making ventilators. So my personal opinion is if these hospitals need ventilators to protect society, then the federal government should do everything they can in order to implement that. As far as future policies, it's one of those things that will probably happen after the fact, after all of this is over with. See where things may have gone wrong before. This has happened with, for example, oil. So we have an oil reserve now. So and this does occur in healthcare as well. We have vaccine stockpiles. And after all of this is said and done, we can probably go back and look and see where we had problems at, where were there issues with supply chains, what industries were affected most, so that you can set aside kind of an assistance fund for that. Right now, I guess it's the tourist industry is being hard hit. Restaurants are being hard hit. And so it's things to consider later. Of course, there's also a great opportunity to modernize certain industries as well. So I've been seeing some very innovative solutions.
Well, and speaking to that, I've seen the stories of people making everything from masks to face shields in their homes just to contribute to the effort. Now that's an interesting.
You can 3D print at home.
Yes. It's just an interesting dynamic here to see that something like this, when you go back, a century to the influenza pandemic, and then you move to this point in time where people have this level of technology at their fingertips to be able to contribute in some way. Those are very inspiring, but also interesting in terms of the modern age that we live in, and how you respond to this. As we kind of close in looking at this, I know you in your research, and you try to get information out there for your students and the public. You have a podcast, and can you tell us a little bit about that and how people might be able to access that podcast?
Yes, we have a podcast called Germomics, and you can access it at germomics.com, or it's on iTunes or throughout. And it was initially developed as a way of teaching to non-biology majors about the impact of pathogens on society, so how viruses and bacteria have changed the course of history, and in some regards how history and policies can affect how viruses can spread or bacteria can spread. So we'll probably be talking about this one next year or the year after, once all the dust settles, and we can kind of analyze it more. The very first podcast we did was actually on SARS, and about how we learned from that and how it affected all types of all parts of life. Even soccer matches were moved, out of China into other countries. So it affected sports then the way it affects sports now. We had to make decisions on personal freedoms versus what was good for the whole. At the time, it seemed kind of invasive, somebody taking your temperature as you walk through an airport, but now it's one of those things that we kind of want to do. Should you stop air travel? Should you have economic sanctions on a country that doesn't participate in helping? So there's a lot to it. Life's very complicated, and everything's kind of woven together now. So you affect one part of the world, and it may affect some other part of the world.
Well, and what we're seeing too is the tension between, as you mentioned, the level of freedom of the individual, and then of course the rule of law. Is how strong is that kind of social contract to live by the rule of law, and then how that is applied and navigated through a crisis like this. This is always an interesting element to people who are in public policy and political science and so on, because it really tests the strength, stability, and security of a society like ours, to see how people, and how they'll respond, and how they feel secure. Is the level of trust there to be able to follow the direction of elected officials, and
for how long?
Right.
walking around town, you see everybody kind of abiding by the guidelines, but how long can we keep it up?
Right.
It's exhausting.
Yes, very much so, especially as open and free as our society is. Well, Dr. Edwards, I want to thank you for joining us today. This has been very informative and will be helpful for our listeners. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing here at Tarleton State with our students, and we'll look forward maybe in the near future to having you back as we get through this crisis and, like you said, have more to analyze and how this might impact public policy, government, and our lives for years to come. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
After the break, we'll be right back with Dr. Cogley and more Cogley and Morrow on Politics.
T for Texas is a Texas-based history podcast from historian Dr. T. Lindsay Baker. Find a new episode every Thursday morning wherever you get your podcasts.
Politics can be confusing, but Cogley and Morrow have your back. Follow them on Facebook. Search Cogley and Morrow on Politics to stay up to date with the show and for all of the sources to follow right along. Cogley and Morrow is a production of the Tarleton Radio Network.
Welcome back to Cogley and Morrow on Politics. I'm glad to be in the studio today, and of course here on the Tarleton State University campus. We are practicing physical distancing. I don't like the term social distancing, but Lance and I are here in the studio, and we're about 6 feet apart. Dr. Cogley is about 600 feet away from us in his office so that we could make this work, but we wanted to continue to bring you Cogley and Morrow on Politics each week as we have numerous issues that we are engaging with and just want to offer perspective that we can, both from us, from our special guests like we had with Dr. Edwards on the show today. But we turn now to get back to a topic that we looked at a little bit last week. I gave some attention to this going solo in the chair, but we had been at the weeks prior to that following this dramatic transition in the presidential nomination process for the Democratic Party with this just dramatic change on Super Tuesday that put Joe Biden in the front, and they continued to follow that the following week with successful primaries. Now we're in a kind of suspended primary process here, which has its benefits and its challenges. Nathaniel, welcome back to the show. Glad to have you here today. It's good to have a sounding board and as well as hear some of the insight that you bring. What do you see are some of those challenges right now, with the focus being certainly on the pandemic and responding to the needs of people and the health challenges in the health system, but knowing that here we've got a process that's ongoing that is set for a November election?
Yeah, it's been very interesting. Biden certainly had established a lot of momentum, big turnaround for him, and he was on pace to get a majority of delegates and wrap up this nomination. But what we've seen with this pandemic is a lot of states have delayed their primary process. Ohio delayed, Georgia's delayed, Louisiana, Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Indiana, Kentucky. We'll see a lot of other states that come up delay and try to go at the last minute. So that means Biden is kind of in suspension here. He has yet to wrap up the nomination, although everyone assumes he will when it comes back. They had a debate on March 15th with no audience because of the pandemic, and there was some substance there. Biden was asked a question about women within his administration and policies affecting women, and he gave a very interesting answer that I think was kind of headline news when we think about this campaign going forward. So we should have that audio clip.
Number one, I committed that if I'm elected president, have an opportunity to appoint someone to the courts, I'll appoint the first black woman to the courts. It's required that they have representation now. It's long overdue. Secondly, if I'm elected president, my cabinet, my administration will look like the country. And I commit that I will, in fact, I'll pick a woman to be vice president. There are a number of women who are qualified to be president tomorrow. I would pick a woman to be my vice president. Number three, I'm the guy that wrote the domestic violence law, and I'm the guy that put in the prohibitions that no one who abuses someone else should be able to own a gun, period. They should not be able to own a gun. I would get the boyfriend exception amended. Now I've gotten it passed that if you get a stay-away order from a court, you have a child with someone, you cannot own a gun. No one should be able to own a gun who has abused a woman, period.
Mr. Vice President, if I could just follow up. Just to be clear, you just committed here tonight that your running mate, if you get the nomination, will be a woman?
Yes.
All right, Eric, I mean, you hear that was kind of three things. They're all kind of, two of them very newsworthy. Number one, he said when he appoints someone to the Supreme Court, it'll be specifically an African-American woman. I don't know that we've seen someone telegraph the gender and ethnicity of their Supreme Court nominee so specifically before.
Right.
And then otherwise, his VP nominee selection, which technically is selected by the delegates at the convention, but usually the presidential nominee has tremendous influence on that, will be a woman. And I don't know that we've also seen that telegraphed so clearly beforehand. We have in the past experienced two vice presidential candidates who were women, Geraldine Ferraro in 1984 and Sarah Palin in 2008. But I don't know that the presidential nominee telegraphed that well ahead of time. So this was rather headline stuff. I'm not sure why he needed to telegraph it. It might have been stronger just to do it when you do it. But it's pretty interesting. It's got people speculating on the short list for his VP selection.
Well, it does, and I think there was and it's hard to tell with Joe Biden. Is this something that he's just saying on the spur of the moment, or if it's something that was planned? But I think it was something that needed to be out, at least to his benefit. The anticipation or the expectation of this, it may have been something that because of the suspension of the primary process and to keep things in the news cycle, so something of this nature, it's very clear that this would elevate this in the news cycle, even with all the focus on the pandemic. If you look back, those choices before, there was intention of having an impact, and an impact that then propelled someone from the convention through the general election. Neither were successful as we look back at that. So that impact was not necessarily as significant as they wanted it to be. And so I think there's a couple of reasons why to have it this early, and I think also it helps to shore up a very diverse constituency that Biden will have to bring together to win the election.
It just shows me a little bit of weakness even in the primary process, because I do think, the VP selection is going to be important, and it may consolidate important support in a state or with a demographic group. It just seems like usually previously when you select a VP nominee, you say they're the most qualified person for the job of all people, without necessarily telegraphing a gender goal in mind. So I just don't know the reason behind maybe coming out with this that it's going to be a woman before you actually select someone. I think it might have been stronger just to wait until the selection. Pick whoever you like, even a woman, and say they're just the most qualified. So it's interesting that he kind of is telegraphing ahead of time.
Yeah, and we'll see. I mean, who the pick is, and then what are the challenges, as we saw with Sarah Palin. Following her selection, and then a number of issues and challenges that may have diminished the significance of that pick. But going into it, I think it's playing the political side much more than it is looking at the level of qualifications. I think yes, there are certainly women out there who are qualified, but I think this is a very good case of politics at play here, where it is the optics of it. It's it's getting into the news cycle at a time when that's very, very challenging given the crisis. But then on the other hand, it's also trying to reach out to certain constituencies to say, hey, I hear you, I'm on board with you. You're going to be represented in this administration.
Yeah, two things with a vice president. One, you want someone who's ready to be president, but two, you want someone who can help you win. So both of those calculations may be going on. Now, we talked beforehand, I think there were on your radar as you've looked through this? I got 6 on my radar. I'm first interested in who your 4 are, and then maybe I'll add 2.
All right, so my 4, and I'll start. I don't have these in any particular order, but the Nevada Senator Catherine Cortez Masto is on my list, followed by Gretchen Whitmire, who is the governor of Michigan, and then Amy Klobuchar and Kamala Harris, which were 2 candidates in the primary that have dropped out, and both have indicated their support for Biden. I think in looking at the field that those are the 4 that are positioned in some way. And part of that is weighing the political benefit of each of these, along with a level of qualifications that would be able to shore up concerns about Biden, maybe his health. That's already a line in this vice presidential discussion that several stories have put in there, that part of Biden's conversation is having somebody in there if something happens to him. I mean, I don't see how that's helping him to be broadcasting that and saying, well, what if I get what my son had, or if I fall ill, we need somebody who's qualified. Again, that's been a challenging point in his candidacy. And so anyway, but if we look at it that way, I think for me, those 4 are very strong possibilities.
Well, I agree, and it's interesting even Biden talking about that someone's going to need to be able to take over the presidency. I kind of hinted at health concerns in a previous episode. Joe Biden would be by far the oldest president ever elected in history, and President Trump is also in his 70s, but he's a solid 4 years younger, which is a whole term younger. So it's interesting that that's even discussed. I will point out the 20th Amendment means even a vice president-elect will become president if something happens to the president-elect in that cycle. So there's just, a lot of importance on this pick given the age dynamics and health dynamics of former Vice President Joe Biden. So as you look at these, Eric, you brought up Catherine Cortez Masto. This is someone kind of off the radar in terms of the presidential selection cycle because she wasn't running, but she's the now senator from Nevada. What do you see when you look at her? Is that a likely choice?
Well, I see here is a prominent Latina in the Senate who has some experience, but has also moved up in the party sufficiently where now she's the chair of the Senate Democrats campaign, which means she has a lot of connections with donors in the Democratic Party. So she's somebody that's already known within the party. She has had the endorsement of Harry Reid. I'm not sure at this point how significant that will be, other than within the party leadership as her being a strong candidate. But I see in her what I don't necessarily see in the other candidates, in that here is a very, very large constituency that's at play, looking at Latino Americans and what their connection is or relationship might be to supporting a candidate, and really the votes in that community across the country are swing all over the place, depending on generation, depending on age group. But here might be a way of mobilizing a group that has not been as mobilized in the last few elections as they were earlier with George Bush and his ability to connect with Latino Americans. So I think this really gives her an edge, even though she may not be known nationally by the general populace as much as she is within her state and within the Latino American community or in this country. I just think that she has a lot going for her on a number of fronts, and could very quickly be propelled out there and be someone that doesn't necessarily have the national notoriety and challenges that, say, maybe a Harris or even a Klobuchar had in trying to run for president. Here's someone that's in the Senate that could step up and maybe be of tremendous benefit to Biden's ticket.
So I agree with you in that she should be on the short list of probabilities here. There is a likelihood of her, and Biden has shown weakness with Hispanics who have supported Bernie Sanders in this Democratic primary quite a bit. So that would definitely help him with that demographic group. It's also an important group once you're going into the general election. If we look at Nevada as a swing state, It's leaned Democratic recently. Hillary Clinton won it by 3.23%, but it would be one of these states we'd keep our eye on because it was within 5 percentage points last time, so that's good. But I've got some thoughts here that we're also looking at a Senate that's going to be almost equally divided. And if they're going to yank out a Democratic senator from a very competitive state, that opens up the possibility of losing that seat, that Senate seat. And we may be in a 50-50 split in the Senate or a 51-49 Senate. And so I think that's the risk with this choice is, yeah, you may have someone who might be a good VP pick for the Democratic Party, but you're risking that very close Senate seat in Nevada.
Oh, yes. Well, and that would be the case with at least 3 of the ones I have on my list. So it would be trying to see which one has the edge over the other.
Sure. So look at who's next on your list.
Well, I think of that 4, I think it's between Whitmer and Klobuchar. I'm a little concerned about Kamala Harris. I mean, I think there is some appeal there. There is the connection with the African American community, but Biden already has that a strong level of support there. It could certainly extend that, but I'm just not sure on that because Harris had her own struggles with appealing to voters in her quest for the presidential nomination, and I'm just not sure how much benefit that would be. She's from California. California is not a state that you really have to worry about in terms of the outcome. So that really puts her at a disadvantage, whereas Whitmer and Klobuchar are all from areas, Michigan most certainly. I mean, that one comes to the forefront because of the need to win Michigan, for Democrats to win Michigan, to be really think that they would be successful in winning the presidency.
Yeah, I agree with your analysis there. Kamala Harris doesn't deliver a state. California leans Democratic very strongly. Her campaign really struggled. So while a lot of people thought, she may be the presidential nominee, it fell apart. She didn't even get to Iowa. Also, in the audio clip we played, Joe Biden is committing to having an African woman Supreme Court judge. That may be in advance trying to signal to that demographic group, you'll get something. You'll get a Supreme Court judge, which may mean he's not headed that direction. His support amongst African Americans was relatively key to winning this nomination already. So I would agree Kamala Harris, I think, would be unlikely. Now, Michigan, when we look at the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, Michigan was a very close state. In fact, it was the closest of states in the 2016 cycle. President Trump won it by 0.23%, and it's got 16 electoral votes. So it is a key state. So I think that's where Gretchen Whitmer becomes someone who should be looked at as probable here. She's going to impact a very key state, and other neighboring states are key states too. So again, this might be someone who's on Biden's radar. She's also, I believe, the only person as a governor with governor on their resume, and governor is pretty good for a resume.
Yes, I agree with that. That Klobuchar, I think, fits in that same category. She had a strong start to her campaign. I think that she showed herself on the national stage that she can engage with at this level. I think that she could very well be a possible nominee, or at least a pick for the vice presidential position. Again, my concern here, and this is where Cortez Masto and even Harris maybe have an advantage in their connection with the broader constituencies that they could deliver. But the state's critical. Klobuchar did, I think, gain some standing as someone who could step into that presidential role if needed. But we'll see how that weighs in the balance when they come to make a pick.
Well, I agree that Senator Klobuchar is on the short list of probable candidates. It really surprised me when, after running for president for the better part of a year, she dropped out the night before she was going to win her home state and endorsed Biden and effectively delivered that state to Joe Biden. It makes me wonder what conversations were going on behind the scenes for that to take place. So I definitely think she's on the short list. It helps that she was running for president, and defied expectations for a while. She had a very good performance in New Hampshire, remember. Also, Minnesota, if you look at the history of presidential elections, it's the last state to ever vote Republican in the Electoral College. It hasn't happened in a long time, but it's become very close. Hillary Clinton won Minnesota by only 1.74% last time. So I call it a swing state just because it has the potential to swing between the nominees. It hasn't historically been swinging, but it has the potential to swing. So she helped solidify Minnesota, and also she could have pretty decent appeal to neighboring Wisconsin, which is also a state that will be an important swing state in this cycle. So I agree that she is on this short list of people who might be selected.
Well, and you said you had 6 that you had on your list, and so that means there's a couple more here, or maybe even I'm not sure if you had these 4 as well, but what other ones do you see that might have an outside chance or even a strong chance of being in that final group for consideration?
So all of these 4 were in my 6 that I had highlighted. So that's 4 of them down. There's only 2 more to go. One of them has been floated out there that is someone we're familiar with. Elizabeth Warren has been running for president. I've seen her presented on a lot of people's speculation. I tend to think she won't be the pick. Massachusetts is not a key state here, but it would be a pick that would try to not appeal to the general electorate, but consolidate the Democratic Party if there was some major controversy with Bernie Sanders supporters. She's someone who could appeal to them. But because of this primary cycle, Biden is kind of headed for a kind of quote-unquote legitimate victory in terms of securing a majority of regular delegates, not super delegates. It may be that Joe Biden doesn't need to pick a VP nominee that consolidates the left wing of the party. He may already have much of that support. So Elizabeth Warren has been mentioned, but I don't think it's probably the good tactical decision.
Right. Yeah, and I would agree there. I also think that there's other factors that may bring more unity to the party through not only the crisis that we're going through and whatever direction of criticism or concern about how the Trump administration responds to it. I think there's other factors there that may influence that, where there is more of a sense of unity. There's not a need to in some way have an active appeal. It's so focused on winning the White House that some of those things are going to be secondary.
Yeah, the other person on the short list that I've seen is Representative Val Demings in Florida. She represents Florida's 10th district out of Orlando. She's an African-American woman coming from humble beginnings, and she has law enforcement history as well. So she was actually one of the impeachment managers in the Senate trial that was, prosecuting President Trump in the Senate trial. One thing about her, she comes from Florida, and Florida is one of the bigger of the swing states. Florida has 29 electors up for grab, and it's a state that President Trump won last time by 1.2%. President Trump has now relocated to Florida. That's now his home state, not New York. So he's also has his own connection to Florida. But she's someone that's on the list. I think this is also an unlikely pick. She's a representative, not a senator, and also, we talked about that African-American dynamic. Joe Biden's already pledged to select an African-American woman to the Supreme Court, and he also excelled in the Democratic primary with that demographic group.
Yes, I agree with that as well. I've seen her name floated out as well, and but I think it's a bigger challenge for name recognition, notoriety. I was just thinking when you said the impeachment process and her being in that impeachment, one of the managers, that seems so long ago now. After all that we've been through here just in the last few weeks, and even now the shift so dramatic, as we talked about on the show, that as soon as the impeachment trial was over, the shift to focus on the presidential election. And as we wrap up here, I think we've got about 4 minutes left on the show for today. But I wanted to get your thoughts on, here we have this national crisis, and underneath that is the continuous move at some point, even more significant move toward a general election. And I've just been thinking about some of the things how this is impacting and making this a very unique election cycle. I mean, I think there are other aspects of that, but the fact that we have this crisis, I was just wondering about your thoughts, and I have some as well, just on how does this change something that has been done in certain ways, in a certain process for so long, even though we've had different challenges in the past. I noticed one story I was reading about where members of Congress were like, no, we had the general election during the middle of the Civil War. We're going to have this election in November, but there's a lot that has made this very unique, at least in modern history, as a general election. I didn't know if you had some thoughts on that.
Well, I would say this is one of the strengths of the Electoral College, is that it can be conducted in a time of crisis. Sometimes in a time of crisis, popular voting is hard to pull off, like as in the Civil War, but that's not actually who selects the president and vice president. It's the Electoral College. So for the states to actually designate their electors and for the electors to vote in their state capitals, that's much more of a clear process than holding popular elections in all the various areas. Having said that, we're in a time in the USA where there is still going to be this definite demand to have popular elections to help select the electors everywhere in the USA. But it creates this problem of voting. If we saw early on, we saw the governor of Ohio be one of the first to delay his primary election. He was criticized early for that, and the governor of Florida went ahead to have the election. But when election night actually came up, the governor of Ohio was largely praised for having delayed to avoid any transmission of the virus, and the governor of Florida came under some criticism because a lot of poll workers didn't show up. A lot of poll workers are elderly and part of that vulnerable population, and they didn't sign up for exposure to coronavirus when they signed up to be an election poll worker, right? So it creates a lot of challenge with popular voting, and to have a vote process where people are able to safely cast their vote, given that all the social distancing protocols that are in place. People should know states have a lot of discretion in how they're going to do these votes. In fact, it's the state governments that are empowered with this process to select electors, not necessarily any popular vote or the federal government. The states are powered, so we could see states vary in how they're going to handle this come November.
Well, this will certainly be an issue that we'll come back to and give more attention as we move forward, getting through this crisis and then on to a general election cycle. We want to thank you for joining us today on Cogley and Morrow on Politics. Tune in each week, Sunday at noon, right here on 90.5 KTRL FM for Cogley and Morrow on Politics.
This has been a Tarleton Radio Network podcast with production from AJ Heyer and Taylor Welch. Find more great shows by searching Tarleton Radio Network wherever you get your podcasts.